Good to go? Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kyle Ehmke. I'm a senior threat intelligence researcher at Threat Connect. And I use our platform to, and our various integrations to develop and employ analytic methodologies to better understand and proactively identify nation-state and criminal APT activity. So I'm really happy to be here and have the opportunity to speak to you all today and talk to you about this idea that I've kind of been ruminating on for some time, which is a framework based on applying thermodynamic principles and physics to cyber threat intelligence. Admittedly, this is the first time that I'm presenting this to someone that is not on my team and is not my dogs. Definitely I would welcome any feedback that you might have after the presentation. If you're wondering about the bow and arrow, when I saw the schedule came out and I was after lunch, I thought this might be a good deterrent for anybody who decides to snooze. My aim is pretty accurate with that thing, so just kidding, or maybe I'm not. If you're interested after the talk, I've got a data sheet up here for you that kind of summarizes all of the content that I'll be going over today. So here's sort of a general overview of what I'm going to be discussing. First, I'm going to start off by talking about cyber threat intelligence and prominent issues within cyber threat intelligence in general. That will sort of lay the groundwork for the idea of measuring kinetic and potential energy and using it as a framework to apply intelligence where there is none and more efficiently employ threat intelligence within your organization. So just some quick background on me. I'm a Hoosier born and bred. I'm originally from Indianapolis. I studied mechanical engineering just a couple blocks over at IUPUI. After school, I got into cyber threat intelligence and cybersecurity, and I promptly never did anything with mechanical engineering again. So I forgot a lot of these specifics from dynamics, statics, fluids, materials, all that, but some of the higher level issues, ideas and theories sort of implanted them pretty deeply up here. So to that end, after I was done with school and working in cybersecurity, from time to time I'd consider similarities between those mechanical engineering concepts and the career in which I'm currently engaged. So one of those similarities became apparent to me when considering various issues with threat intelligence and its application in cybersecurity. And that's what I'm here to talk about today. But first, I think it's sort of important to level set and define cyber threat intelligence so we're all on the same page when talking about kinetic and potential energy later. So what is cyber threat intelligence? Well, Gartner has this pretty fancy and accurate description, evidence-based knowledge including context, mechanisms, indicators, implications, and actionable advice about an existing or emerging menace or hazard, to assets that can be used to inform decisions regarding the subject's response to that menace or hazard. That's a bit wordy for me, so I kind of like to simplify it a little bit. And I like to think of cyber threat intelligence as who the bad guys are, what they're doing, how they are doing it, who they're doing it against, why they're doing it, and what they will do next. In my opinion, cyber threat intelligence should address all of these, but at a minimum, 2 of them. So now that we've established what threat intelligence is, let's talk about some of the issues with it. I would argue that threat intelligence is still more of a niche occupation within the cybersecurity world. At many organizations, incident responders or SOC personnel might be dual-hatted as a threat intelligence analyst. Organizations with dedicated threat intelligence teams or individuals are a rarity, and many times those organizations still have issues integrating the intelligence analyst with the typical incident response function and wind up not really seeing or realizing the full potential of threat intelligence. I'm not saying that those things are anyone's fault. Certainly, a lack of resources is a valid reason and concern, but those shortcomings often manifest in specific problems like a lack of intelligence requirements. Now, if you're asking what are intelligence requirements and why do they matter, don't worry, you're definitely not alone. A lot of the organizations that I've worked with or read about or talked to don't have defined intelligence requirements or even know what they are. So to summarize, intelligence requirements essentially identify what intelligence analysts at a given organization will focus on. If you consider the intelligence cycle here on the right, intelligence requirements are a part of the planning and direction phase. So let's say that you are an organization that's in the healthcare sector. An intelligence requirement for your organization might be to identify activity targeting the healthcare sector. That requirement would then dictate the sources of information that you collect or procure. It would also dictate how you might go about processing or exploiting that information, as well as the specific intelligence analysis that you produce from exploiting that collection. And it would also affect how you ultimately disseminate and integrate that analysis at your organization. And so I'll talk more about intelligence requirements in a little bit. But another issue that I've seen with threat intelligence are so-called intelligence feeds. Indicators in and of themselves are not threat intelligence. I hate to rag on a report from the government, but consider the Grizzly Steppe Joint Analysis Report from 2 years ago. There were hundreds of indicators from Russian-related activity that were shared in that report, but the context that was shared with each of those indicators was insufficient to, at least in my mind, actually qualify as intelligence. And I refer you back to that previous definition of threat intelligence. Those different points were not answered in that report and aren't answered in many intelligence feeds or reports that are out there. And finally, the last issue that I'd like to call out is a general focus on known bad activity or indicators. Don't get me wrong, this is a completely necessary effort, but it fails to recognize that the fact that if we are employing threat intelligence to its fullest extent, we can proactively identify indicators that might be used in malicious activity in the future, but aren't yet known to actually be malicious. What you're left with when you're focusing on known bad is playing whack-a-mole with indicators that possibly aren't even being used in operations by the time that you hear about them. So going back to intelligence requirements just briefly, oftentimes individuals that hear about intelligence requirements for the first time will say that they want to know everything about everything, so everything is their intelligence requirement. Well, not to poke fun, but if that's how you're doing it wrong. If everything is your intelligence requirement, you'll end up being inefficient with your defensive and intelligence analysis resources. Intelligence requirements also have to be relatively specific so that the execution against them within the intelligence cycle can be tracked. Now, I'd argue that these basics here aren't even specific enough, but for organizations that are getting started with threat intelligence, I think that there are basic intelligence requirements that your organization can use. So these might seem overly simplified, which they certainly are, but they are still significantly more specific than everything and can give threat intelligence teams a general heading. So those basic intelligence requirements are activity targeting my sector, activity targeting my organization or my organization's specific data types, and activity emanating from our known adversaries. So ultimately, with all these issues and thoughts swirling around in my head, I wanted to find a different way to approach these issues. I wanted to find a way to evaluate indicators to identify those that should be focused on or take priority. I also wanted to take into account things that weren't known bad and push that proactive defensive effort. My hope was that this could also incorporate basic intelligence requirements that might be different based on who was looking at the indicator and what organization they work in. And having a way to apply intelligence to data or scrutinize that data for intelligence was also important. Finally, for consumers, I wanted there to be a way for them to identify collection requirements or shortcomings that they could later address. There's also the other side of the coin as well, the intelligence producers. I wanted a way for those providers to identify shortcomings in their shared intelligence or evaluate intelligence for their consumers to more efficiently use and employ. So with all these things in mind, I admittedly got a little inebriated during Black Hat last year and started thinking back to my studies in mechanical engineering and how thermodynamic concepts might be applied to threat intelligence. So in that somewhat inebriated state, this is what I thought of. So kinetic and potential energy. Kinetic and potential energy are different states of energy that describe the ability of an object to do work. Kinetic energy results from an object in motion, such as a moving car. Potential energy comes from an object's position and might be converted to kinetic energy, like holding a ball above the ground or a compressed spring. All variety of scientists, from chemists to physicists to engineers, measure these energies to better understand how objects are acting or will act within a given situation or system. Now, just to hammer things home, let's consider a bow and arrow. All right. All right, so when I draw the bow, I'm actually putting potential energy into the system. So right now, this string is essentially acting like a compressed string. Now, when I let loose the arrow, as it flies through the air, it has kinetic energy. That potential energy that I put into the string is translated into kinetic energy. Now, if you think about it, I was going to point this out at the audience, but I thought maybe that wouldn't be a good idea. If I were to point a drawn bow and arrow at you, you would immediately go into a defensive state. So think about that as I'm talking about potential energy a little bit later. So let's consider that we're House Stark from Game of Thrones, and there's an arrow that we have to physically defend Winterfell or our organization against. Generally, this arrow is going to have several characteristics that we want to understand to determine if and how we defend against it. That might include whether the arrow was actually shot, whether the bow holding the arrow has been drawn, where the arrow was shot from, what the arrow was shot at, how fast the arrow is traveling, and who shot the arrow. Now, ultimately, these things boil down to our threat intelligence and mimic our earlier definition of threat intelligence. A quick spoiler alert right here. If you haven't seen season 6 of Game of Thrones and are intending to, definitely look away or close your eyes for the next 30 seconds or so. All right, go. So let's bring our arrow comparison back to cybersecurity. Those arrows aren't significantly dissimilar from indicators. In some cases, there are indicators that we aren't going to care about because they weren't shot at House Stark or at any of our fellow houses. those things that we want to know about arrows relate to our intelligence requirements. Many of those intelligence requirements manifest in the physical energy properties. Was the arrow shot? How fast is and where is it traveling? Is the bow drawn? So maybe indicators in the cybersecurity world have relatable energies that we can measure and evaluate to better understand them. All right, if you were avoiding the spoiler, you can now look back. So when considering kinetic and potential energies, there are certain variables that we want to make sure to include in our equations to capture the necessary data points for the indicators that we are evaluating. For kinetic energy, we want to include the velocity, the vector or direction, and its degradation over time. Velocity is simply going to be binary. Is it active or not? The vector is going to be a combination of binary relative factors. And what do I mean by relative? Well, it's going to depend on your frame of reference, the organization that you're in, the sector that you're in, and what data you safeguard. And that calculated vector will be different depending on those different factors. Now, if you're thinking about the diamond model for intrusion analysis, this is really going to be describing the relationship between the adversary tools and infrastructure, as well as the victim. And then for degradation, much like gravity or friction ultimately reduce kinetic energy over time, time, in our case, is going to reduce the kinetic energy of an indicator. For potential energy, it's a little bit more nebulous. The main variables that we are interested in are the height or compression and the degradation over time. Degradation is similar to what it is for kinetic energy, but height or compression is where things kind of get a little bit sticky. And this is going to be binary, and again, relative to our frame of reference, like vector is for kinetic energy. But it's going to necessitate a better understanding of our adversaries. So when we throw all of those variables against the wall, here's kind of what sticks. This is our equation for evaluating the kinetic energy of an indicator. U is whether the indicator has been used in an attack. S is whether your organization's sector was targeted. O, whether your organization was specifically targeted. D, whether your organization's specific data types, like PMI, were targeted. And A, whether the attack was carried out by an adversary that is pertinent to your organization. T is the age of the indicator in days since it was first identified, and P is the number of days over which you deprecate malicious indicators. And again, I see some folks taking pictures. If you're interested after the talk, these sheets I've got up here summarize all of this information. So let's kind of break this down a little bit more. So ultimately, kinetic energy is going to be, for a given indicator, is going to be different based off of who is evaluating it and what organization they are a part of. So usually I'd argue that any indicator with a kinetic energy greater than 0 deserves additional attention of some sort. And the higher the kinetic energy, the more pertinent the indicator is going to be for the individual or organization that's evaluating it. To start off, if the indicator hasn't actually been used in an operation, U is going to be 0. So the kinetic energy for that indicator is going to be 0. In that case, we'd move to potential energy and evaluate that. So thinking back to our variables, this is essentially the velocity of the indicator. Soda, I know most people in Indiana say pop or Coke. Sorry, I couldn't make those acronyms work. But this really represents those distilled, basic, inherent intelligence requirements that I spoke of earlier. For our equation, we're treating all of these factors equally, but when doing this for your organization, you might choose to change it up a little bit. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And this part of the equation really represents the vector, essentially where that indicator is directed. And finally, the last part of the equation represents our degradation variable. The kinetic energy is going to decrease over time and ultimately approach zero or negative values based off of your deprecation period. So here's our equation for potential energy. The important variable here is C, which is whether the tactics associated with a given indicator are consistent with your adversary's tactics. So we'll break down this one a little bit more. Potential energy should only be evaluated when an indicator is not known to have been used in an attack. Potential energy really correlates with what might happen that is relevant to a given organization based on their known adversaries. When indicators with potential energy greater than zero are addressed, organizations are being proactive in their defensive efforts. And like I mentioned earlier, potential energy really necessitates an understanding of your adversaries and their tactics. I can't stress that enough. When those things aren't known, that can be considered an intelligence gap. And like with kinetic energy, potential energy will also degrade or deprecate over time. It should be noted as well that the period over which you deprecate these suspicious indicators might be different than the period that you deprecate known bad indicators like we did with kinetic energy. So let's go ahead and apply these equations and use these energies to better understand a group of indicators. And we'll evaluate these indicators from the perspective of 4 different organizations. A financial company specifically working with cryptocurrency, and pharmaceutical, media, and sporting organizations. Admittedly, these are kind of cherry-picked, but hopefully they give you an idea of how we can go about applying this framework to a group of indicators. So here are the 4 indicators that we'll evaluate. Arkawi.com was identified in a 2018 APT-10 operation targeting organizations in Japan. However, no context was given for the type of sector or data that was targeted in that attack. IKNTrust.com was identified in a 2018 Fancy Bear operation using LoJack, but no targeted sector or data type were included in the report. The IP address 222.122.31.115 was identified as part of a Hidden Cobra operation targeting the financial sector, and specifically, they targeted data and individuals related to cryptocurrency. Finally, FIFAcups.org was not identified in operations, but the domain was actually registered through a suspicious, the domain uses a suspicious name server and is hosted on a dedicated server. And those tactics are actually consistent with previously identified Fancy Bear tactics. So let's measure these different indicators for their kinetic and potential energies based on those organizations that I mentioned earlier. And this is very tough to see. My apologies for that. But each of these columns represents a variable within our equation. And remember that these values are going to be different based off of what sector we're in, what data types we secure, who our adversaries are, and our deprecation. So for the purposes of this demo, we're actually saying that the financial cryptocurrency organization deprecates malicious indicators after 180 days, whereas the 3 others deprecate them after 360 days. So for the Arkawi.com domain, it was identified in an APT-10 operation. That adversary has previously targeted financial and pharmaceutical organizations, so it is a pertinent adversary for them, thus the 1 in the A variable for those organizations. So after applying deprecation based off of today's date, these are actually the kinetic energies, and I'll show a better slide later that shows those a little bit better. For IKM Trust, similarly, while we don't have any information on the organizations or data types that were specifically targeted, it was used in a Fancy Bear operation. Fancy Bear has previously targeted media and sporting organizations, so there's a 1 in that A variable for those organizations. And they end up having the same kinetic energy for this indicator because their deprecation period is the same. Taking a look at the IP address, it ends up having a kinetic energy for the financial cryptocurrency organization and media organization. The kinetic energy is actually higher for the financial cryptocurrency organization as the IP address was used in a hidden Cobra operation specifically targeting the financial sector and cryptocurrency. And for all the previous indicators, the potential energy was 0 because the indicators had been identified in active operations. Now for this FIFAcups.org, that's not the case. So we proceed to evaluate its potential energy. Now, given that FIFAcups.org is consistent with previously identified Fancy Bear tactics, including the use of a suspicious name server and dedicated server, media and sport organizations have a 1 for that C variable, while the other organizations have a 0. Ultimately, their potential energy score ends up at a 0.811 based off of this suspicious deprecation period. So here's a summary that is a little bit easier to see of the results that we just went through. When we rack and stack the findings for each organization, we can see how organizations might go about prioritizing the review of some indicators before others. For example, the IP address would be a higher priority for the financial cryptocurrency organization, while a lower one for the media organization. We also see that within these results, there are no potential energy scores for the financial or pharmaceutical organizations. If I go through this analysis for a number of our sources and don't have any potential energy scores, that is something that can feed our collection requirements. Maybe we want to pursue a different source that focuses on identifying suspicious indicators associated with our adversaries' tactics. So several important notes here to call out now that we've kind of gone through an application of the framework and done the analysis. Whenever you're going through this analysis, every time you say to yourself, I don't know, that is an intelligence gap. And the more that you work through those intelligence gaps, the more that you'll build a baseline for who to follow and why. An important aspect of this framework is that it requires a general understanding of your adversaries or forces you to learn more about them. Like I also mentioned earlier, whenever you have a lack or very low score of either type of energy, that's a collection requirement, a collection gap. Procuring or acquiring additional sources may help mitigate those deficiencies and result in better intelligence for your organization. From the intelligence publisher or creator perspective, they can apply this framework to improve the utility of what they share. If they find that they can't identify the variables that go into these equations from their reports, there's some additional context there that they should or can investigate and ultimately share. Additionally, if they were to provide calculated kinetic and potential energies for affected organizations along with their reports, then that might ultimately facilitate consumption and integration of their intelligence. At this point, this is a really manual process and more of an analytic technique or framework. However, we're investigating ways to employ this at scale against larger sets of indicators and include it in our own intelligence reports as well. It's also important to note that for some reports that are about one instance of activity, you only have to calculate the scores for a single indicator. That same score would then be accurate for all of the indicators in that report. Now, while I went over our specific equations, this idea and the equations are extensible. The main issue is capturing that velocity, vector, and degradation. But maybe you want to treat your assessment of that vector differently. Maybe you want to include other basic intelligence requirements like country targeted. If so, then this is how your equation might look. Or maybe you want to exclude unknown variables to mitigate shortcomings in reporting. By using n instead of 4, where n is the number of variables that you're actually including, this equation could do that. Or maybe you want to weight certain variables differently to reflect more important intelligence requirements for your organization. Then this is maybe how an equation like that would look, where activity targeting your organization is more important than the other variables. That vector section of the equation is where you can easily change things up based off of your own organization's needs. So just a couple caveats to end here. This is definitely not a silver bullet. This is going to take some time to work through and apply at your organizations and ultimately evaluate indicators. A lack of standards in industry reports also will kind of hamper automation, so employing this against larger sets of indicators or larger sets of reports. So that's something that we're still looking into. And I know that this isn't going to be for everyone. It's probably going to hinge based off of your own threat intelligence program's maturity. Some people might completely discount it. Others might consider it a worthwhile thought experiment. Others, it might serve as an auditing function. And then, maybe if you want to build a threat intelligence program around it, you can come talk to me. That would be great. So this is just a summary of what we went over. Again, this is a framework to apply intelligence and context to data. It incorporates distilled intelligence requirements and allows you to evaluate indicators based off of the specifics of your organization and your sector. Hopefully, by employing this framework and conducting this analysis, it can help you build a baseline and better understand what adversaries and activity you should focus on. It's also a way of auditing your intelligence program and identifying collection and intelligence gaps. And hopefully as well, it can help push your intelligence capability in your organization as a whole towards a more proactive defensive effort by suggesting or allowing a focus on things that aren't necessarily known bad. And so with that, I'll kind of open it up for questions. All right. Well, cool. Again, if you're interested, I've got data sheets up here for you to take that summarize this information, and I'll also be around if you want to come up and talk. So thank you very much.